Hey, so what did you think of the boot camp yesterday?
Man, if I had to describe it in one word, I would say energy. You know that
Yeah.
feeling like when you see the chat, it's like Jake said, "Where's everyone from?" And then it's just like you can only just briefly look.
Yeah. Yeah, it's impossible to keep up. It's so fun to see the enthusiasm that people have
Yeah.
for well, in this case, I guess I should explain what we're talking about. We yesterday we ran a Foundation Sprint Bootcamp. So it was the first time that we did any kind of interactive training about the Foundation Sprint, which we recently introduced with our new book Click, and we offered this workshop yesterday for people who pre-ordered 8 or more copies of Click. So these are like super fans who are like really into sprints. Many of them run their own design sprint businesses. They like change their careers after reading sprint and like learning how to run design sprints. So yeah, this is kind of a special event for them.
I think the interesting thing is you said is like the community part. Like
Yeah.
that's kind of insane. What was your high point?
Well, it was the way we ended up doing it was kind of interesting. Jake had this idea at the last minute, which was to instead of just teaching the method, he suggested, why don't we actually demonstrate a foundation sprint? So Kristen, who is on our team, and Jake and I, the three of us, we pretended to be the founders of a coffee company. And so we actually ran through a full foundation sprint, and then participants had the option to either just kind of watch and listen, or they could participate as well. We created a in the Miro board, we created another section where they could kind of play along as we went. And so I thought that was cool because I thought that it created the surface area for us to not just talk about here's the method, here are the exercises, the steps, but to talk about sort of do a little bit of inner monologue on like, well, here's what I'm thinking about when I'm identifying competitors or I'm trying to figure
Right.
out where we'll be the most differentiated. So that was really fun. And the other thing that got me excited was people have questions about things that we just don't know about. So for example, like, people would ask like, how would you recommend selling this into a corporate client? And it's like, I have no idea. Like, I've worked at big companies, but like, I've never been that sort of consultant person who's trying to close like a corporate deal. And this happened with the design sprint and with the sprint book as well. As we actually learned a lot from the community. It wasn't just
Yeah.
us, standing on top of this mountain, like sending down edicts. It was like definitely like a two-way or a multi-way collaboration, where as people went out and tried things, we learned from them. We incorporated those into future versions, updated versions of the process. So that hasn't quite started to happen yet, but I can tell it's going to. And that was very exciting.
Totally.
All right. Well, we've got you back for another podcast episode. Should we go ahead and kick it off?
Let's do it, man.
Awesome.
This is Jake and Jay-Z. This is Jake and Jay-Z.
Welcome to episode 16 of Jake and Jay-Z, the weekly podcast about startups, design, technology, marketing, other stuff that we are thinking about and working on. I'm Jay-Z, co-founder of Character Capital and co-author with Jake Knapp of Sprint, Click, and Make Time. And if you want to get our weekly newsletter with the latest episode and some other cool stuff that we found, go to jakeandjz.com. Jake is off today, but I'm super lucky because I've got my co-founder and partner, Eli Blee-Goldman, here back again to talk about some of the recent developments in AI and what that means for the future of how people will build products and build companies. And if that sounds familiar, it's probably because it was also the subject of our last podcast episode. Last time we had what I think ended up being a pretty interesting conversation about AI and what was at the time kind of the cutting edge of new models, specifically some of the newer models that had been released by OpenAI. And then as tends to happen in the AI world, like 2 days after we recorded that episode, DeepSeek R1 came out. So the DeepSeek had made a minor splash back in December, I think, with V3. That was the sort of the one that was on everybody's radar. And then they released R1 in January. and the world just kind of like freaked out, like the stock market sold off, like all the VCs took to Twitter to pontificate about like what this meant for the future of technology. And a few people reached out to us, especially after the last episode, and they were like, hey, we want to hear what you think of this, and specifically what you think of this, Eli. So anyway, we decided to reconvene here and do a follow-up episode. Why don't we start with just a little bit of background? Eli, can you kind of tell us like, where did DeepSeek come from? Like, why did it make such a splash?
Yeah, so DeepSeek came from a very large Chinese hedge fund called Highflyer, and they had been doing all sorts of algorithmic trading over the years. And the founder of the firm is actually a big fan of Rentech, which is a hedge fund that has done extremely well.
Yeah, like a legendary quant hedge fund. And our geeky claim to fame is that we've co-invested with one of the employees or partners of Rentech. He's now doing some VC stuff. So we feel like pretty cool by association.
That's right. Yeah. And I remember when we made that investment, we were both pumped. We were like psyched about it, but the rest of the world didn't seem to know too much about Rentech.
Yeah. It's a very specific Venn diagram of people who would be excited by that information.
Totally. Yeah. And the interesting thing about Highflyer as this large algorithmic trading fund is that they had acquired a lot of NVIDIA chips, specifically these, I think they're called A100 chips, before there were restrictions placed on them. And so they were able to get, I think it's 10,000 of these before US restrictions hit. And they released this model that really changed how people think on two ways. The first is the primacy of the very large mostly US-based foundation models being the only players in the game. I mean, there's a few others, but basically I think that was the common thought.
Right. There was kind of this accepted narrative that the only way to compete and hopefully to win in that market would be to raise billions of dollars, to have as many chips to hoard chips, to hire thousands and thousands of the world's best AI researchers. That was the archetype. And so this kind of tossed a bit of cold water onto that smoldering fire.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And I think that's exactly the second point I was going to make, which is cost. There's like, people thought there were these incumbents. There were basically, maybe they could be peeled off a little bit, but basically not.
Yeah.
And then the cost, just as you said, like everyone thought, man, you have to raise 10 billion, 100 billion, a trillion to make a really great model. And what the results from DeepSeek seem to show were that's not the case at all. They claimed that they did it with 5.5 million, and they did it with 2,000 chips of this H800 chip. And if you think about something like Llama, by Meta, they had trained this gigantic model with like 16,000 of these like H100, like amazing chips. So it seemed to challenge a lot of those notions. That was my take. What about you?
Yeah. And to be clear, there was some controversy. There continues to be some controversy about specifically how cheap was it? But I think even if it's off by an order of magnitude, and even if it was only $50 million, it's still so much less capital intensive than a lot of the other models. Yeah, that was, I think those were the headlines for sure. I think there were some interesting, essentially product improvements. And just to level set, like, DeepSeek is fundamentally, like, simple version is like, it's an LLM chatbot. It's like ChatGPT, it's like Claude, it's like Gemini. It's a tool where, you open it up, you can ask it to do things for you. You can ask it to research things, to help you write things, summarize, it's et cetera. It can help with coding, all the same stuff that LLMs are good at. So it's another one of those. Just if you're listening and you're not really sure what we're talking about, it's another thing like ChatGPT. There was, I think, a pretty interesting product improvement that you kind of brought up even pre DeepSeek. You mentioned the last time we chatted about this, which was this notion of expanding test time compute. So basically taking more time. The impulse with software, and truly with any product or experience, is always that faster is better, right? Like, you're putting a query into a search box, you're prompting an AI. Why wouldn't you want the update instantly, right? Why wouldn't you want the results to come back instantly? But in this case, taking a bit more time actually produces better results. And then the other really interesting thing was that R1 specifically, does the R stand for reasoning? Is that or not?
Oh gosh, or reinforcement learning.
Oh, that's right. Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
coincidentally, then R1 also became known for showing its quote unquote reasoning. So you can almost see it think. If you use it, it's sort of it's exploring. It's kind of sharing some of its inner thought process, if you will. And so, regardless of cost, regardless of where it came from, regardless of anything else, those were two sort of interesting product improvements that a lot of the other bigger names sort of raced to catch up with. And so I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating one. And it actually cuts to the heart on a couple of the specialties, as far as I understand it, of what DeepSeek is doing. And one of those is this notion of like the active parameters. So, when you have these big models, like you can think about the parameters as like adjustable numerical values, like in the model that are learned from training data. And so these determine the outputs that you get, it determines the behavior of the model, et cetera. And while R1 has a lot of parameters, I think it's on the order of 600 billion or something, in any given moment when you request it, it uses many fewer active parameters than competing models, something like, 4.0 would. And the way that they do this is they kind of split it into like expert modes. So the model is trained to have an expert mode. So presumably if you say like coding question, it's not sending it out to the whole like trained model. It's just sending it out to like the coding question domain. So I thought that's kind of an interesting and smart way to go about improvements.
Yeah.
And I think that's led to some of the decrease in costs, which are crazy. I mean, I looked this up from a while ago, and the API costs at the time, I'm sure they have shifted, but the API costs that I saw reported were something like 14 cents for input and $2 for output per million tokens for R1, compared with O1 at the time, which was $15 for input and $60 for output. And so if you look at that, man, it's like more than 100x cost difference for the input. So I think that's what had people concerned.
Yeah. A couple of the things that caught my attention were that these models are fully open source. As far as I know, it's possible that, well, I shouldn't speculate about things I don't totally understand, but like you can go to the GitHub page and like you can see like the code. So like very, very open. They are also doing what I would describe as like building in public. This is something you sometimes see founders doing, like really being super transparent about like what they're building and what they're learning. And I would say that DeepSeek is very much building in public. Like they're really transparent about what they're doing. To me, this kind of all added up into, reinforcing the point, the very first point that you made, which was like the notion of dominance by a few select players, a few chosen players is, I don't want to say it's over, but really there's, I think, a lot of doubt around that model now. And it points to something that we have seen with the companies that we look at and the ones that we invest in, where like increasingly what we're seeing is that amazing AI innovations are coming from anywhere. Maybe we can talk about a couple of examples in a little bit, but like there's a couple of founders that we know who are like in their early 20s who are working on models that are challenging stuff that's coming out of Google and, in terms of speed and accuracy. If you zoom way out, like, and you set aside, okay, like how much cheaper is it? Like, is the product better? Showing its sort of reasoning, its thinking, like set that all aside. Like, I think the big theme is like, this stuff can come from anywhere.
Yeah.
And the world is far more distributed. The world of innovation and cutting edge research around AI is far more distributed across dimensions of geography, of age, of capitalization than anybody thought before. And that's super exciting.
That is, yeah. And what a great way to put it. It sort of sparked in my mind as you were saying that with each model release, intelligence is becoming more distributed than ever. But we're still seeing like pockets of very deep expertise, very deep intelligence that is not evenly distributed, even with these big models.
Right.
And so that's a really fascinating dynamic. I think that some people believe doesn't exist anymore, but we're still seeing it.
Yeah. So, all right. Anything else? Was there anything else specifically about DeepSeek that stood out to you as kind of being noteworthy, newsworthy, or did we kind of cover the main factor?
I have a few more things that I just want to touch on briefly.
Cool.
So the first is that we should not be so naive as to take these numbers at face value, especially around the
Right.
costs. So
Yep.
we should be clear that I think both of us are a bit skeptical on that. At least I am. I
Yeah.
think you are as well. And this input can be used for training. And so I think this is a question that both corporations and certainly like nation states have to increasingly ask themselves, which is where are these deep, useful queries going, and what are people doing with that information?
Totally.
And so I think that has come to the fore in a much greater way with this model.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting to see a few companies. Perplexity was the one that was most obvious to me, actually, because DeepSeek is open source, actually integrating their model into Perplexity, which is a US based company running in data centers, presumably in the US, in a way that avoids those issues. But yeah, that I think is a super important point.
And maybe to that end, actually, with the Perplexity, I think there's this notion that I really believe that alignment should be viewed as iterative. And so by that, I mean, we typically think about quote unquote aligning an AI model as a discrete output. Like it's
and can you define briefly what alignment is in this context?
Yeah. So I think in the context that I'm going to use it, and this will not be the universal definition, it basically means like good for humans. That's what I'm going to say. Like my definition here.
Yeah. So like our interests are aligned. The interests of the AI and the interests of humanity are aligned. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. But I think what the rapid pace of the development of these models has shown is that it really is more of an iterative process. That's how we should think about it, especially because they're trained off of each other. And one of the controversies with DeepSeek was whether they use this method of distillation in training the model. And so this is a method by which you use sort of like the outputs and even the chain of thought of another model, and then that's sort of the teacher model. And then you have a student model that learns from those outputs. And so that's interesting because you can have compounding gains in knowledge. You don't have to retrain everything from the outset. But I think there's a really interesting question here, which is, does distillation get you closer to the ground truth of any given thing, or does it have, an error propagation mechanism in it? And I'm not sure, but I think that's probably a risk as these models become smaller and distillation is used more deeply. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I don't. I agree that it's an important question and a risk, particularly as people continue to push at the edges of what's possible with AI, and they try new applications, new ways of leveraging this technology. And we see it too. I mean, there are ways in which we use AI where it's like, oh, clearly that was useful and helpful and good. And, apart from the odd, hallucination here or there, like mostly right. Yeah. But then there's other times when we use it. And I just ran into this. The bootcamp thing, I tried to basically create an AI summary of the questions that were in the chat. So there, like you mentioned, there was this like hyperactive chat feed of people asking questions, and we were jumping in to answer some of those in chat. And that was a case where I used multiple different products and models and prompts. I spent about an hour working on this morning and couldn't get a really useful and good result. And so I think that there are a lot of cases like this where, as we continue to push further and further and try newer and newer things, obviously models will continue to get better and products will continue to get better. But if they get divorced from the ground truth, I love that phrase that you use, if they get divorced from the ground truth and they start to almost become self-referential and, kind of feed on things that other models produced, you end up with these results that they look okay. Like if you skim them, they seem reasonable and good. But if you actually understand the context and the meaning of the content and you look closely at it, it's like not good. It's not valuable. It's not right. And so anyway, I don't know where that's going to go, but I totally agree with you that that's an important aspect and an important open question of this. Cool. So should we pivot into maybe talking about what some of the impacts or implications might be for people who are building products with AI, or people like us who are investing in AI products?
Yeah, I think we should. And I want to give the hardest question to you first, which is like, Has this changed your view on AI investing in general at all?
So in general, I don't know. I don't think so. Not like big picture in general. But there's a specific type of company that we have invested in very limited situations, which is a sort of a research-centric AI startup, kind of a frontier research type company. And we have this framework that we sometimes talk about at Character when we're evaluating startups, which is sort of the 4 different strategies that AI founders can take. And in reverse order, those are product. So it's really just about can you create a great product leveraging AI? It's still really hard to make great products. Okay, that's something that some founders are really good at. Another is distribution. Do you know how to market, to sell, to distribute, to put a product, an AI product or technology in the hands of customers in a way that's going to really work for them? Another is data. So do you somehow have access to a type of data, proprietary data in a particular industry or particular type of business that is harder for other founders to get access to? And the fourth one is research. Are you fundamentally doing cutting edge net new research on models that other people can't do or most people can't do? And the investments that we've made in that category are things like Phaedra, which is a team from DeepMind who had built AI agents for controlling the cooling systems for Google's data centers and are now offering that product to other companies. Orbital, who has created models for designing molecules for new physical materials. Inductive Bio, who has models that predict how drug molecules are going to interact in the human body ahead of clinical trials. And in those cases, we've been willing to make those investments because the teams were truly world-class, truly exceptional, and they had done things like that before. So in the case of, well, really all 3 of those, but especially Phaedra and Orbital, the teams, when they were at DeepMind or they were in their previous roles, they were publishing papers on this stuff. They were years before people were even paying attention to AI. These teams were already out there on the horizon, like doing this research. And so that gave us, we pay close attention to stuff, but we're not researchers, right? Like we're not academics. Like knowing that they had done this before gave us confidence and allowed us to build conviction as investors. All of that is a sort of a long preamble to say that I think the thing that where I've been updating my worldview a little bit is seeing that such unexpected and such dramatic innovation and advancement can come from such an unexpected place. And combined with a few of the founders that we've recently met and have been investing in, it gives me a lot more confidence that you don't have to be credentialed. You don't have to be like the ex DeepMind, the ex OpenAI, the person who's been doing this for a decade. You can just be smart and scrappy and hungry. And you have the potential to, on that research frontier specifically, you have the potential to compete with some of the biggest and most capitalized companies in the world. So, I don't know that we're going to become like a deep tech investor or anything like that, but this has certainly like opened my eyes to that style of investing in a greater way than they were open before.
Yeah, I love that point. And I also want to encourage any founders or potential founders that are watching this to reach out to us, especially if you have these bold and ambitious ideas, because I think one of the things that you're seeing here, and you've probably heard about both in podcasts with Jake and Jay-Z in the past, and then also at our firm, is it's just the 3 of us. So we are nimble and we move fast as well. But if you're working on something really, really awesome, just like tell us about it. we want to know about those hard things, because when I heard this 5.5 million figure, I mean, I was skeptical, but then at the same time, I was like, well, that's sort of like a chunky seed round. Like, what does that mean?
Right. No, that's super interesting. Yeah, because we had in the past we'd said we're not mostly not going to invest in foundation model companies because they're raising $100 million seed rounds, right? That's just clearly outside our focus area. But yeah, to your point, like, if you only need $5 million, like now we're getting closer to the typical range for a seed round.
One thing it's highlighted for me, and I'm dying to hear your notion on this as well, Jay-Z, is that deciding when to utilize any given tool versus a different tool has become increasingly hard because the cost decreases so fast, the models improve so quickly that it's almost like if you wait another week, you probably will save, you'll have saved like that week.
Yep.
So like, I think it's become increasingly hard to decide when to press go on like whatever you're building.
Yeah.
I don't have a great answer for that, but I think that's something that founders need to think very closely about.
Yeah.
And it probably gets to the heart of your end goal. And so I think like once hopefully you run a foundation sprint or you run a design sprint, you start to get clarity on what you're building, what it might look like, and then execute on that. But just know that if you wait another week, there's the possibility that execution could be even faster.
Totally.
Which is just sort of insane.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And it reminds me of, there's an archetype of founder that we sometimes meet that I think of as, I mean, these people are usually software engineers, but I think of them as AI practitioners. They're they are really good at understanding exactly what you're talking about, which is which existing tools to use, which things to build yourself, and where it makes sense for you to invest or not invest. And there was, I'll try to find it and include a link in the show notes, but one of the founders in our portfolio, he posted something on LinkedIn that was like, AI has helped me build so much faster than before, but I'm also cognizant of that the 3 to 5% of whatever I'm building that I know if I just wait a couple of months, like I'm not going to have to build that anymore. And so there's this it's almost like a capital allocation game of like, yeah, where do I invest versus where do I outsource, and understanding how that is shifting over time. So yeah, I agree that has become a really important almost skill, almost, and it's very nascent, and we don't even really have the terms for it because it's not the same as like just a pure software engineer. I mean, software engineers, obviously, they always use off-the-shelf tools. They're building on lots of frameworks and infrastructure and things like that. But something feels a little bit different, I think, just in the capabilities and in the pace of some of the building blocks that people making products can use today.
Totally. And I think about in the past software era, you often had to wait until a new release came out, a new OS or something. You had to wait. You had to buy it. Usually it would be more expensive. Usually it would have more features.
Right.
But there was sort of a definite date that it was going to happen. So you knew, well, I should wait until this happens, or I'm going to be building off of this, version of Flash or whatever.
Or like a particular database that you've chosen, or where what cloud environment you're going to host in, and
exactly. Yeah, and now we're in this weird world where every day it's cheaper and better. That's odd.
I sort of foreshadowed this a little bit, but I thought it would be interesting to talk just anonymously. We won't name names because I think most of these, if not all of them, have not really been announced yet. But our last 3 investments, they each demonstrate a very different but related implication or perspective on what's happening. The effects that we've just talked about, better, faster, cheaper, distributed innovation, all these things that we've been talking about as implications of DeepSeek. The last 3 of our investments, I don't know, this framework just sort of snapped into my head recently, and I thought it might be interesting to think out loud and share with you and get your feedback on it. So the first company, the most recent one, I briefly mentioned them before. These are literally they dropped out of college. They're in their late teens, early 20s. And they recently produced a model that, I won't say exactly what it does, but a model that is competitive with models from Google and other large companies on some specific tasks. Not like an LLM. It's more specific than that. And these are really, really smart founders, of course, very brilliant engineers, but they're 20, it's not like they've spent their careers on the forefront of this world and have been credentialed and published and all these things. So I think of that as sort of the distributed innovation kind of implication. Is and for every one like this, there's 100 more probably that are doing something similar and interesting that previously felt like it was the sole domain of either well-capitalized, big companies, or the credentialed AI researchers. So anyway, curious if you have any takes on that as one archetype, one example.
Oh, I think you're exactly right. And what sprung to mind for me is how much this team also built in public, like truly
Totally.
built in
Yep.
public.
Yep.
And that was the thing that allowed us to get an understanding of why they were exceptional. And so
Yeah.
they weren't making promises. They're not marketers. They're just builders and executors.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we could see that. And I think that's the signal. Like that was the credential for me versus like trying to say, oh, this person worked at, Google in the past, or they went to all these great schools and then they did the typical thing. Like they didn't need to do that. They just sort of built and showed it to us.
Absolutely. Okay. So let's call that company A,
Okay.
the first example. The second example, we literally just wired last week. This is a very fresh investment and very different than company A. We'll call this company B, very different, but I think also representative of some of the implications of DeepSeek. And this company is building in the tax space. And they are the prime example of where deep domain expertise really matters.
Yeah.
They are not going to be developing, new models, new foundation models at the frontiers of research, right? They're going to be using tools that exist. They're going to be using models that exist, but they are solving problems that the typical YC founder could not just get up to speed on in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. These are things, these founders have literally spent decades in this domain, learning about the ins and outs of taxes and regulation and accounting and finance and all sorts of related intricacies that are not easy to pick up. And so I thought that was a really interesting archetype. And it's one of the patterns that we look for, where if you understand how to use this technology, if you understand, what we were just talking about, like when to build versus when to adopt, how to put those pieces together, but you can pair that with deep domain expertise, expertise and experience that is not easy to replicate, that becomes a really powerful combination. And the more that the tools get better and, faster and cheaper, the more important it will be to have domain expertise, because the obvious solutions and products will just be that much faster and easier and cheaper to build.
Yeah, you're so right. And I think this Venn diagram of these type of people, it's like the people that have the experience to do this is like probably like very tiny.
Yeah.
And the people that also have like sort of the vision or knowledge, it's like even tinier, like when you do that overlap. So there has to be very few people like this. I think this is a rare type of founder, like sort of the rare Pokemon, that like suddenly appears. But it's fascinating to see how much accumulated or compounded knowledge these two founders have. I think that's rare. And then it's even rarer that they were like, oh, let's make this, let's make something new utilizing AI.
Yeah.
Like it's really, really interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So in this little framework we're laying out, company A was two young college dropouts who are challenging big tech for doing frontier research in AI. Company B is experienced engineers who founded a company. They have very deep and difficult to obtain domain expertise about tax, which is the world that they're building in. They're not going to be doing cutting edge research on the AI side, but they know how to build on top of the tools. They know how to use what exists in the world. Company C was I think our last investment of 2024, and is a healthcare founder who is, I think, in our portfolio, probably one of the best and the top three of the AI practitioner archetype that I described. So certainly also has domain expertise. He's also, a brilliant engineer. It's not as if, I don't mean to undersell him in any of those other categories, but he's the one who I mentioned with the LinkedIn post that I'm going to find and link to. He is so tuned into how can I use what exists in the world today to build faster than anybody thought was possible. And then as I'm doing it, how can I make sure that I'm not investing today in building software that is going to be off the shelf, available a month from now, and understanding where that boundary is and just being really efficient with his time and his resources so that he can focus not on building a bunch of stuff from scratch, but he can focus on what I think is the hardest and most important thing when you're starting a new company, which is what is the product?
That's
Does it
right.
work for founders? Is it going to click? How do I get it into those founders' hands? He's using all of the tools, all the infrastructure, everything that's available in the world today to sort of build up the pyramid to focus on that one essential foundational element of company building. Sort of watching him work is just kind of a master class in how to do that. So I thought that was another interesting example of how company building is changing as a result of things like DeepSeek and other new and exciting models that are coming out seemingly every week.
What's been cool is how much Sprint and Click and just that all of those methodologies have helped guide how he sort of reined in these various aspects of company building. Because at the very beginning, he told us, well, I want to work with you guys because I want to do it right the first time. Now, doing it right the first time does not mean getting it right the first time, but it means approaching the process from the correct way. And I feel like he's at this point now where he's like, the sled dogs are like guiding him, and the sled dogs are like the various AI models, but he's certainly like, guiding the sled, and like, hopefully somewhere in this analogy, there's the path that we laid out. This is one of the traps actually of utilizing AI as a builder, is that you can end up getting too many like paths opened up, and so you're doing this thing, and they all seem very alluring. They all seem, probably it's a compounding error thing. They all seem great, but if you don't have that focus of where are we actually going, you can end up in a really terrible spot with a bunch of cool looking pieces, but nothing that's actually getting you to product market fit.
Yeah, that is super insightful. And I think because there is so much enthusiasm throughout certainly the technology world, but the business world and just, the world in general, there's so much enthusiasm about AI right now that I think there's a lot of false lights at the end of those paths. You spend a little bit of time down one path, and there's going to be some people who are probably pretty fascinated by what you're doing. Are they customers? Are they going to pay? Are they going to commit? Are they going to change their workflow? That's harder to tell. That's harder to figure out, but they're probably going to be kind of excited about it. And so you get these little glimmers of, I think there's a light down there. Oh, what about over here? I'm going to build this.
That's right.
I can pivot so fast. I can build new things so quickly that without some type of framework for deciding which of those paths are the most promising, and then very quickly improving your vision to see if that is in fact a light at the end, or if it's just an optical illusion, you can end up just kind of flailing.
Totally
moving faster, but not always in the right direction.
That's exactly right.
All right, cool. Couple of things I just wanted to bring up with you really quick before we sign off. Thoughts on Grok?
I never would bet against Elon Musk.
Yeah.
No one should bet against Musk.
Yeah.
I think that's been proven over and over again, certainly as a founder. And I was looking at Chatbot Arena recently, and by the time you all see this, who knows where chocolate will be, but it's number one right now. It's broken 1,400 on the Arena score, I believe, for the first time. And so this is a really good result and ranking for X. And again, it shows that the pace of improvement, certainly on math and coding and other problems, it's only increasing. It's kind of remarkable. If you look back, all of the top models right now, if I scroll through, they're all pretty darn recent releases. Past couple of months.
And Grok is interesting because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Grok is it's like the anti-DeepSeek from a capital use and sort of resourcing standpoint, where they just threw money at it. They're just like the most GPUs, the most sort of compute time, and just try to climb the scaling wall. Is that about right?
I actually don't know. I'm going to be completely transparent. I'm not sure on this part of it. I don't know.
Cool. All right. Well, I'll look up some sort of blog post or something and link it so that people can check our work here, check our speculation. And then finally, literally when we signed on to record this, you told me about something super cool that I literally hadn't seen, which was Google released a product or a suite of products, I'm not entirely sure, called Co-Scientist, AI Co-Scientist. Can you describe that briefly?
Yeah. And I also literally just saw this before we signed on. So this is real time. And so my understanding is that it's a system that uses multiple AI agents in conjunction with a scientist to sort of come up with and figure out research goals. And so if you recall the last AI podcast when we were all talking about what's next, we talked about this notion of multi-agent interaction. So we had chain of thought where we let models think longer. And then the sort of speculation that we saw is this notion of like, well, what happens when you let models or agents work together? And I think that's what you're seeing here. There's some recursive elements where there's like generation agent, there's a reflection agent, there's an evolution agent, a few more. And then you sort of rank them, and it's like the self-improving loop of results is how I understand it. This is interesting because I think this will help in narrow ways to figure out those ground truths. Again, this isn't a training question. This is a results question, but it will be very interesting to see what the actual implications of this are. But I think that like, as we think about increasing scientific discovery, which is, math comes first, then science, then everything else.
Yeah.
This feels quite weighty on the science part of things from what I saw.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so for one brief moment in time, we're caught up on the latest, unless something was announced in the last 45 minutes while we were recording. All right, should we call it here?
I think so, man.
Cool.
All right.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Eli. Really fun to chat about this stuff with you. Thanks for coming back to help shed some light on what's going on in the AI world. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Head on over to jakeandjz.com if you want to get a weekly email newsletter with the latest episode. And if you have a question for us, send it to hey@jakeandjz.com and we can answer it on a future episode. Thanks, everybody.
This is Jake and Jay-Z. This is Jake and Jay-Z.